do not discount your services. That's a downward spiral. That's why people have cash flow problems, is because their sales reps are like, look, I got a competitive situation right now. If I can give them 10% discount, I can close that deal. We can get the deposit check. I got some people who are sitting here idle. It's better to keep them busy. No, it's not.
Welcome to Evolve Radio, where we explore the evolution of business and technology. I'm your host, Todd Kane. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Stephen King, President and CEO of GrowthForce. GrowthForce is one of the largest outsourced accounting services in the U.S. His experience as a top executive in a Fortune 500 company is now put to work helping his team provide accounting system design and data-based management for their clients. In our discussion today, we talk about the tough times that likely lay ahead for the economy in 2021, why and how businesses should prepare for a rough economic future. We also chat about the human element and how to balance the needs of the company with the desire to be a compassionate leader. Regardless of where you're at in your company's journey, you should always know your numbers. This episode is a great resource to reflect on what you need to know and how you should be preparing for the future in order to protect your company. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast so you get every new episode. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please leave a rating and review in your podcast app. This helps others find the show so we can reach more of the community. Now, on with the show. And joining me on the podcast today is Stephen King. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Todd. Good to be here.
So today we're going to be chatting about cash management in a crisis. Cash management is a ever-present and always required need for a business, but I think that this topic is going to become more and more relevant. I think a lot of organizations have seen the challenges that have been 2020 in all aspects, and one of the things that I really wanted to dig in with you, Steve, is we had kind of chatted beforehand, and I'd suggested my worry that the economy is not going to look great probably kind of into early 2021 and beyond. Part of my concern is I think there's a lot of government money sloshing around in the economy, which creates sort of this false appearance of the water kind of being higher than it is. And once that money drains out from the system, that many businesses may start to experience the rocks on the bottom of this situation. Wanted to bounce that off you and get your perspective. You deal with a lot of organizations and managing their books and their finances and setting them forward on a manageable path. So I'm sure you think a lot about this, and I'm curious your perspective on what you think the challenges of this new economy are going to be.
Well, I strongly agree with you. I think the worst is ahead of us. And I think the worst of it is ahead of us for a number of reasons. And we work with a lot of technology-based businesses. So it's kind of a tale of two cities. It's not just that the PPP money has pretty much run out for those who have gotten it. As we're recording this, we're right on the verge of figuring out the results of the election. But either way, there's the underpinning of where we are is challenged because the federal government's debt to GDP ratio is right now 137%, and a good economy it's 60 to 80%.
Wow.
And if there's another $1 trillion that gets approved, which is probably going to happen because it's politically, everybody wants to take care of American small businesses. It's the backbone of the economy. We're moving to 150% debt to GDP. And what that means is we're going to face inflation. We're going to start seeing the impact of deficit spending. Taxes are inevitably going to have to rise, and the costs of everything are already starting to rise. We just got our health insurance bill for 2021, and COVID's going to have an impact of additional costs in the marketplace. And so what that means is that, to my mind, there's kind of like a 5 steps to weather the storm. The first is you got to get the right mindset. You got to make data-driven decisions and not emotionally driven decisions. This is really hard right now. I mean, I am 60 years old last month, and it's never, ever been this hard. Work is hard. Your clients are struggling. Your employees, I got people who got COVID and they're struggling, and their kids are, home from school. And then you go home and it's, the worst news cycle of my lifetime. And then, there's a lot of fears. We've got a 81-year-old mother-in-law living next door, which means that you can't take a risk of bringing a disease and everything all combined, the kids in the schools and their identity. I've got 2 kids, 22 and 19. And so you take all this stress, and it's hard to not bring it to the workplace and come from a position of fear. And what we're finding is that when you really look at the real numbers, it's not as bad as you think. The first thing that we're helping businesses do is figure out, what scenario are you in? Are you in survival mode? Are you in restructure mode? Or are you in a position where you can strengthen? And I'm really surprised how many businesses are in a position of restructure and strengthen. It's like over 80% of our clients. Now, we don't do a lot of retail, so we're not struggling with that. We do service businesses and nonprofits. And now is a time where if you really focus on getting data at your fingertips that's actionable, then you can start to make decisions over the next 6 to 9 months and come out of this stronger.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that the IT industry in general has largely been buffeted from the effects of the sort of the issues in the economy. So I think that people, again, like, it gives you sort of that false impression that maybe things just aren't as bad out there as maybe they would be or they could be. So I think that is a bit of that mirage around, people when the lockdown first started, everyone kind of tightened their belt and went to defensive. But it all seemed kind of for naught. Certain sectors, I knew some MSPs that were heavy into the hospitality part of the business, and they were quite heavily hit. But for the most part, everyone saw a minor deduction in their projects and procurement. Others saw a huge increase in that. Some saw sort of a limited spend for new opportunities, and others saw double-digit growth in new revenue. So there's such a dichotomy of what's going on depending on where you sit. I think it's a good perspective of where are we right now and what do we need to get a hold of. I think maybe some numbers, if you could, around what should be people focusing on. Obviously, if you're not reading your P&L and managing your finances, certainly on a month-to-month basis, you should probably be looking at that. But where should people start?
Well, I just literally hung up the phone with a client who's a managed service provider, and when we were reviewing they're going into their year-end planning for 2021 right now. They got their traction meeting, and I'm a big fan of Gino Wickman and the EOS model. The number one driver is recurring revenue. And that's what keeps you afloat during good times and bad. And that's why I said earlier, it's kind of like a tale of two cities, right? The companies that have real strong recurring revenue streams are thriving. The ones that are primarily project-based are struggling. Now they're starting to come out of it because, like you say, the fear is people are starting to feel like, okay, I've made it through the worst of it. But my view is the worst of it is ahead of us right now. I hate to say that because I'm an optimist. I am, absolutely a guy whose glass is not only half full, it's filled with red wine, right? And I look through those rosé colored glasses all the time. But I just see the combination of the deficit and the political uncertainty and the healthcare costs and all the other things that we already had. The number of baby boomers who are coming onto Medicare, all that stuff is giving us already some headwinds. And now I think that's first step is, getting the right mindset is having the data to understand what are your different scenarios. Is it we're gonna lose some top line, or we're just gonna stay status quo? There's only 3 drivers of success in increasing profits, right? It's your top line revenue. Are you going to grow that? Is it going to stay status quo, or are you going to start to see some decline, especially on the project side if things got worse? Do you have an above the line problem? To my mind, the number one most important number of any company is gross profit percentage.
Yes.
It's why the Shark Tanks always ask you,
what are your margins?
How much did you sell it for, and what does it cost you fully landed? Because they're doing that percentage calculation. Yep. There's 5 drivers in every business: gross revenue dollars, your top line; gross profit dollars; gross profit percent, which to me is the most important; and then net income dollars and net income percent. And so you have to look to see, do you have a top line problem with your revenue, or where most businesses I see right now, we look at hundreds of businesses' books every month. Most businesses right now are struggling with the above the line costs, the cost of goods sold, or in a service businesses, the cost to deliver the services. And there's only two types of above the line costs. They're both direct costs, right? What the customer has directly paid for. It's your direct labor, the labor the customer directly paid for, and your direct materials, the stuff you had to buy, the hardware, the software licenses, the routers, the wiring, all the things that are needed to buy to earn the income. Those two costs, direct labor and direct material, go above the line. And the line is gross profit. What I'm seeing right now is most businesses are struggling with that gross profit percentage because, just like the company I just left, revenue has slowed, but you don't want to fire your people.
Right.
Your most valuable asset is your people. It's also your biggest expense. 70 to 80% of your expenses when you add in health insurance and 401k and recruiting and training. And the cost of replacing somebody is one of the biggest insipid costs in a P&L. There's no line item that says cost of turnover, but you see it in lower margins. You see it in increased overhead, in training and all these other hidden costs. And so you want to be looking at your gross profit margin right now. What does that trend look like year over year? And if that's not trending the same way with your revenue, then you've got to start to look at what are the above the line opportunities. And there's a lot there. That's step 3 in my process.
Okay. So I want to pause here. There's a couple of things to dig into. What I find, especially in our industry, I'm sure this is probably the same in all other industries, but entrepreneurs and business owners, they tend to see if they have a cash flow problem or they're having a profit problem, their only tool that they seem to be able to pull out is we need more revenue. Right.
Yes.
And this drives me crazy because they often are not looking at the profit percentages and what their cost of goods are, when there's plenty of opportunity to either sell to the existing client base or to tune the operations. And sometimes I sort of have to check myself because I'm a former VP of operations, sort of the COO role. And, is this just the hat that I wear and the perspective that I bring? Can you give me your perspective on that? Is the everything is a nail when you're a hammer, revenue solves all problems, actually a stronger position than I tend to think it is? Or are people just sort of that's the only tool that they have?
Oh man, you really touched on something that I'm passionate about. I just discussed this because they're trying to figure out their year-end planning for next year. Most businesses think they can sell their way to increase profits. Okay, what is that? Why do they think that way? Well, if I can increase my top line and I don't have to increase my overhead, then I'll be able to have that extra money going into the bank account. And that's a fallacy. It's only true if you improve your pricing. If you find the time leakage. Let's go into that, dig into that above the line drivers, right? There's 3 drivers to success. Top line, gross profit percentage, netting, and overhead, right? If you can increase your top line and increase your gross profit percentage and lower your overhead, any combination of those 3, you'll increase your profits. But you can't just sell. You have to increase margins in order to increase profits, or at least profit percentage. Because what happens is, as you increase your revenue, your overhead's likely to increase at the same rate. Your sales and marketing costs are going to go up. You're going to pay commissions. You're going to have to hire more salespeople if you're going to try and grow. You're going to have to pay more for marketing and SEO and SEM. The biggest driver on profitability is increasing your gross profit percent, which is why it's the number 1 measure of every business. And the way you do that is you need to study what is your actual cost to deliver your service. The payroll, labor costs, not payroll, fully loaded labor, which includes the taxes and the health insurance and all the benefits, and recruiting and training are the biggest expense every service businesses have. And what you have to do is use your PSA, your ConnectWise, your Autotask, your Kaseyas of the world, and take the timesheets that are in there and use that to allocate your payroll. And depending on which system you're in, depends on how easy it is and how automated. Kaseya has the most automation. They integrate with QuickBooks Online and QuickBooks Desktop, which QuickBooks has 82% of the market. So they're the dominant force because it's so powerful if you unleash the power of QuickBooks as a management reporting system. And when you use Intuit Payroll or Insperity, which is an outsourced HR company, those two have automated what they call activity-based costing. And activity-based costing used to be a concept that was only available for the Fortune 1000. I was at Ernst & Young for 7 years. I was a manager of accounting system design, and my clients were Fortune 100 companies. And what I've seen is if you are able to implement job costing, you now have the ability to have unit economics. And what is unit economics? Unit economics is the profitability on the work that you do, profitability on your unit. In a manufacturer, it's your widget, right? How much do you make on a widget? But in a service business, a unit is whatever you put on an invoice. It might be a seat, right? It might be the project. It might be the milestones or whatever you invoice your customers, right? You've gotten X number of seats that you're charging Y dollars for. You have to see the economics of those units. And when labor cost is your biggest expense, the magic is doing that job costing, that labor cost allocation when you run the payroll. And it's pretty simple. Like, this client I was just talking to has Autotask, and their Autotask doesn't have a great integration to QuickBooks Desktop. It does for QuickBooks Online, but so that's okay. You can copy and paste the timesheets out of Autotask into Excel, and then use an importer tool that we've got to suck it into QuickBooks. And then once it's in QuickBooks, when you run the payroll, it's automatically allocating that labor cost based on how people fill out the timesheets. Now, since you're doing your billing is, you sync all your invoices into QuickBooks, you now can see profitability by customer, profitability by job, by service item. Now, when you see that profitability on the work that you do, on the units, now you can start to aggregate units and say, okay, which types of services make the most profit? Which of my teams make the most? Is it my break fix team, my help desk team? Is it my contract clients or my project clients? Which industries are the best? Where do we add the most value as a company? Do we do great? Like you mentioned, some people specialize in healthcare, which is challenging, but if yours can see, I make the most money, like we make the most money on serving white collar service businesses, then you can tell your marketing department, get me more that look like this. And what'll happen is if you add the most value, you're going to have the highest margin, you're going to have the most profit. So studying that above the line cost is way more important than trying to increase your top line revenue.
So a couple other things I want to dig in there as well. First, the focus around gross profit, I think, is really important. And you touched on the fact that gross profit on those unit economics are really, really critical. Most of sort of the smaller or less mature MSPs that don't have a more detailed view of their finances, they tend to just focus on the profit of the organization. And they don't really have a lot of deeper analysis around, certainly what are the clients that make money. When that's always a measure that I think is really important, again, from tuning that operations. If you find that a client that represents 10% of your revenue consumes 50% of your help desk, you have a serious problem. And if you're not entering the time against the contracts or having some unit economics around that, that's a really difficult thing to find, and versus to just have a gut feel on that. So I think you're absolutely right on having that deeper understanding. More further on the gross profit, what people tend to focus a lot in the industry, and this I think is driven by the great work that Dipple does with service leadership, and everyone pounds the drum on EBITDA, and it's always the measure in M&A. Everyone's always sort of like, what EBITDA should I have, and how much could I value my company based on this? And there's a sort of a word of caution that I would maybe put out around EBITDA, and feel free to check me on this. You know finances probably better than I do, for sure. With the focus on EBITDA, I think is practical, but I think people often get a bit sort of faked out by it. And I think that where that combination of gross profit and EBITDA is an important measure. Because I think what people often miss is EBITDA still factors in investment in the company and the company's growth. So the EBITDA, in my mind, is almost a variable number. You can't say that this company is necessarily better than the other company unless you really understand where are those costs going. So if you have two equal companies, A and B, one company has a higher EBITDA percentage, but has very little investment in the organization and its staff, and potentially will result in higher churn, versus another company that has lower EBITDA, but is making massive investments in growth through marketing and investment in their staff, then those are not the same thing. And one is certainly not better than the other unless you understand the contributions towards EBITDA. Whereas gross profit, in a large case, if you have the detail in it, is probably a better measure of just the raw performance of the service delivery. You kind of check my math on that? Am I right? Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right, but I think for a slightly different reason. Gross profit is what creates EBITDA.
Yeah.
So to my mind, that's why EBITDA and net income are the second most important measure of the health of the business. Because, and again, we do management accounting, right? I'm a CPA, and you mentioned, I've been a CPA for 35 years. You mentioned that most businesses look at their income statement, they just look at the P&L at the company level. It's because that's what the accounting industry creates, right? They do financial statements, and financial statements are very different from management reports. And both of them can come out of QuickBooks, and you need both. You need an income statement and a balance sheet. But unless you can drill down to the work that people are doing, unless you can work backwards from the decisions you're trying to make each day to understand what are the drivers of that decision, and then, and only then, figure out what reports can you use to make a data-driven decision, you can't increase EBITDA. And the EBITDA is a great number. I love Paul Dipple and all his work. EBITDA is a placeholder for cash flow, and that's why it's so valuable. But it's the result. It's not the source. And the source of EBITDA and the source of profits is margins and gross margin and contribution margin. So to my mind, the first focus is really trying to understand, what does it really cost you to do that? And what I see a lot in technology companies is, you mentioned the people side and the investments in the people. It's all about the people, right? It's not that, the people are not an expense. I mean, even though they are technically, right, as an accountant, they're going to show up on that P&L, but you really have to be thinking of them as an asset. And what's the difference between an asset and an expense? An asset is something that you invest in, and you invest in it in order to get a return. I buy a stock and I expect a dividend. I expect that stock price to appreciate. I learned, we became an Insperity client 8 years ago. And as an accountant, I always thought of people as an expense. You want to increase profits, well, you have to do an expense, cut expenses, right? So my mindset for, most of my career was, I want to pay as little as I can in salaries. I want to have I get the cheapest health insurance I can get, and turnover is just the cost of doing business. And we typically, the average turnover in the United States is 19%. In the accounting industry, it's 21%. There's not enough knowledge workers to do all the work that has to be happening. And that's really true in IT. And so when you look at trying to increase profitability, the reason why I agree with you, Todd, for the importance of seeing the investments, especially investments in your people, is when you invest in your people, they stay with you along. And turnover is the most insipid cost you have in a business. There's no line that says turnover expense, but that drives the revenue per employee, the labor cost per employee. You have to spend a lot of money on recruiting and training those new people. And the companies that are wildly successful have low turnover. The AICPA, the highest body in the accounting land, they did a report called Valuing the Human Dimension. And what they said was, they recommended that publicly traded companies should have a required footnote disclosure for employee turnover.
I love that idea.
Why? Why would accountants care about turnover? Because there was a direct correlation between companies that had teams that stayed together for a long time and earnings per share. And the market leaders have defined a culture. They understand behaviors that are successful. They recruit for those behaviors, and then they train the heck out of their people, and then they recognize and reward the people who contribute the most to profit, so that you get them acting like owners. That's why I like to look at gross profit, because if you have low turnover, if you invest in the efficiency and the training of your people, you're going to see it in your margins. And that's the most important way to measure how your people drive your profit.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that perspective. The first blog post that I put on my website when I started my company 4.5 years ago was managing turnover, right? Because it's so critical. I do a few presentations. To me, it's really a hallmark, because I focus largely on the management and the team structure, the management framework of how you lead people and produce productivity. So I'm big on the fact that those systems help to retain staff and lower costs. And you're right, it's an insidious number, because people don't tend to think about the cost correlated with it. And the numbers that I've seen vary wildly from 50 to 150% of the annual salary you're replacing. So if you have an 80K position, that person quits, it potentially costs you at least 80 to 120K in replacement cost. Never mind sort of the soft costs losses of having to potential tribal knowledge or the cultural disruption that those things create. So I agree. It's such a big thing. Similarly, kind of related to that, Another thing that we wanted to talk about with around the people is if you're coming into sort of this cash crunch and the issues that you're potentially facing in maintaining the cash flow and maintaining some level of growth in your business, a lot of people are now weighing, what are my options? I want to do what's necessary, what's best for my business, but that may result in some decisions that people are not necessarily comfortable with. They may have to lay off long-term staff. I'm curious sort of what your guidance would be on how do you balance the need or the desire for a leader to carry some compassion and have some space to be able to retain staff despite some struggles that they may balance. How do they balance that the needs of the business and the needs of the people in their organization? How would you think about that?
And this is it's the first most important decision every business will make is pricing. The second is hiring and firing because people are your biggest expense. So, it comes back to those 5 steps to weather the storm. So first step was getting the right mindset. And what that means is getting the data, right? So step 2 is getting control of your cash flow. And what that means is the first thing, if you're trying to figure out, do I have to furlough or fire anyone? Well, first you've got to get the data. What does the next 13 weeks cash flow look like? And we recommend 13 weeks because that takes that long to be able to solve a problem that's going to happen. You can't, if you can't make payroll in 3 weeks, there's not enough time. I mean, you can run around, and try and do your emergency collections, and you can try and generate some quick bills and get a couple of deposit checks in the door. But that's when you make bad decisions. That when you start operating from a position of fear. The worst thing to do right now, if you walk away from one thing from this podcast, is do not discount your services. That's a downward spiral. That's why people have cash flow problems, is because their sales reps are like, look, I got a competitive situation right now. If I can give them 10% discount, I can close that deal. We can get the deposit check. I got some people who are sitting here idle. It's better to keep them busy. No, it's not. Believe it. Unless you have no opportunity costs, right? There's nothing else those people could be doing. When you start to discount your services, it creates a downward spiral. And so you've got to do is you got to look at the cash flow for 13 weeks to anticipate how bad is this going to be. What I found is got a client in New York who, we used our cash flow template with them right after the New York City shut down in March. And he called me the next day and he said, I just finished with your team and I want to know, this is the first good night's sleep I've had in 3 days. It's never as bad as you think it's going to be. And when you see all the sources of funds and all the uses of funds, now you can do something about it. Now you can start to say, all right, you know what? I'm going to have to call my accountant and say, I need a couple of months grace, or I'm going to call my landlord, or all the things that you start to get into problem solving mode. And that's where the data helps you get the emotions out of this. You're not, when your head hits the pillow at night, you can't be in a position of fear. Otherwise, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So step 2 is step 1 is get the right mindset. Step 2 is look at the data and then implement the best practices in cash flow. So collections is you want to ask?
Well, it was just if we wanted to hit on, we kind of cycled around 1 and 2. I think we mentioned 3. What are 4 and 5? Just let's run through the list and then we can.
Sure. So step 2 is managing cash flow because that's the blood, right? That's what causes you to have to make cuts. Step 3 is if you have to make cuts, let's focus on below the line costs first. Let's focus on overhead. Before you go to the decision about firing your moneymaker, your people, let's look at every single line item that you've got below the line. So first is to see, can you convert some of those fixed costs of having headcount in the back office into a variable cost by outsourcing it. So, IT is a great example. If you've got a full-time IT person and your revenue has gone down and your headcount is going to go down, if you had outsourced it to an MSP, now your costs are going to go down because you have fewer seats that are needed. Same thing is true with accounting, HR, anything that you're doing in the back office. If that's not your moneymaker, if that's not your core competency, then that's where I would start to cut first. And then look at everything that's discretionary. There's a lot of savings in travel and people, rent costs may be going down. We don't have to pay for office cleaning or office supplies. All those costs are the first one. Then that's step 3. Then step 4 is now you review your above the line people. Who are the people that drive profits? Who are your most valuable people? How many can you afford to keep? And then which ones should you furlough if you have to? but it's only after you have looked at everything else.
Right.
And then step 5 is once you have figured out what's the right size for your company, then you got to get back on offense. You got to sharpen the saw. You got to look at the people that you're keeping. Think of them as an asset, invest in their training, then invest in their productivity. How do you automate everything? When in the cash flow step, we talk about one of the simplest ways to reduce back office cost is to automate billing and collections and bill payment. I'm amazed how many people still have never looked at how many steps it takes to get an invoice out the door and how much time they spend on paying bills. All that can be automated, and that's a real easy way. The last step in step 5 on playing offense is now's the time to create a budget. Why? A couple of things. Harvard did a landmark case study where they said the simple act of writing down goals increases your likelihood of success by 82%.
That's a huge difference.
Big difference. And I read that report and I thought, as a CEO of a small business owner, I thought, okay, I want to know that. I'm not great at writing down goals. And what I learned was there's a couple of things that are obvious. You're going to get alignment. You're going to get people all rowing in the same direction. But the report got into Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of need. And if you make money on people, you really need to understand how Maslow applies to business. Above survival and safety is a need for belonging. We all have a need to belong to something bigger than ourselves. It's why college sports is such a big deal. Churches, political parties, community groups, sports teams. And work is the second most important group that anybody belongs to after your family. And when you have a company goal and you cascade that down to the department and down to the individual, what Harvard found was people are not going to let the team down. You start to get discretionary effort. You start to get people acting like owners because they belong to a team. And if you have the last step on the human capital strategy, you have a rewards and recognition system so that they know why increased profits is good for them and their family. You're going to have people who are going to give you that extra mile. They're not going to spend there's 2 hours wasted every day on average. And right now with fantasy football leagues and Christmas shopping on Amazon and, who knows what they're doing on Bumble and, whatever other dating sites, you start to get that extra 2 hours of productivity of them working for you because they know what success is and why it's good for them. So, that's the 5 steps. To my mind, playing offense, step 5, sharpening the saw is the most important. And that budget really has an impact. It also turns your income statement. You mentioned that income statement that the CPA gives you. If you add a budget, it makes it actionable.
Yeah.
You can start to see where do you focus your time?
That's a big one. You mentioned earlier about having scenario planning, and I wanted to circle back to that because I found that was really, really helpful for me as an operator, not an owner in the business of really coming up with game plans with the owners, and we had sort of predefined ideas of if this then that, right? So we expect to have 20% growth. If we have 10, then this. If we have -5, then that. Right. And that is really, really helpful that like you said, you're then making data-driven decisions that have an objective reality and you're not just reacting and feeling emotionally about what the case is and being able to establish that alignment between the owner and the operator and having those preconceived game plans, I think is really, really helpful, especially going into a season with a ton of unpredictability on hand.
Mm-hmm. And especially, this is perfect timing, right? The end of a year, the beginning of a new year. We recommend there's 3 cases you want to do your scenario planning. Your worst case, your mid case, and your best case. And you want to look at 2 things. You want to look at what's the change in revenue, best case, mid case, worst case, and then how long will it last? How long will it take before you can turn that corner? Are you going to lose 10% of your revenue? It's going to take, 3 months, or are you going to lose 50% of your revenue over the next 6 months? How bad does this get? Or how good could it get? And then there's only 3 drivers of profits in a business: top line, gross profit percentage, and overhead. So what does it look like, those 3 scenarios? What does it look like if your top line goes up or flat or down? What does it look like if you can increase your margins by a little bit? This client I was just mentioning, by increasing their profit margins by 5%, from 51% to 54%, help them increase their profit from 12 to 17%. That's giant. And why does having an impact in gross profit have such a profound impact on the bank account and the bottom line? Because nothing else changes. all the extra dollar goes right into your pocket. Whereas if you try to grow your top line revenue, you have to spend money to make money. And so you have a 100% benefit of finding time leakage. This is the one that I think most of our clients gain the biggest value. When you have activity-based costing, when you can see the time that people spent and the labor costs, now all of a sudden your visibility is, where did I miss the pricing? Where did I miss project manager, client interactions with emails and phone calls, or the quality control? I got a ticket. How many went to level 2, level 3? What does it really cost you to serve a seat? And by having that visibility, it allows you to demonstrate the reasons why you're worth more. What's the value that you give? Again, we work with, dozens of managed service providers. There's a big difference between the ones that have quick escalation and the ones that it's like, all right, well, let me find my level 3 guy. He's out at a client now. 3 days later, they call you back and it's like, yeah, so tell me about that problem. It's like, wait, I lost 3 days. Well, if you have that escalation because you have the people, you can explain why you're worth more. This is not a commodity business. You're not selling soybeans. What's your unique value proposition? Who's your ideal client profile? And that will allow you to be able to generate the margins to cover your costs, including the overhead, and generate your target net income.
So operations is key to gross profit then?
Yes, it is. And I'm not saying that because you're a COO.
Excellent. This is not a paid endorsement for the services done and the improvements made, but they are material. I think that's the point that I think is really important, because the work that I do, it doesn't seem to be common knowledge. And I think that's not necessarily mystifying to me, but it is perpetually frustrating that people don't recognize that they have the keys in hand to enhance the performance and the profitability of their business without having to go to market and win a bunch of business. That just tends to be, like I said, that hammer that they want to use for everything, when they have much more control over what's happening right underneath them.
Yeah, and here's the 3 steps that we typically recommend. Once you can see the profitability of your client, and if you don't have the job costing and all the the activity-based costing that we recommend and we implement, there's another way to do it. You can use standard cost accounting, standard cost rates inside ConnectWise or Autotask or Kaseya, or whatever your PSA is. The most important step here is that you've got to reconcile every single month what's your actual fully loaded labor cost per employee and update the standard cost rate inside your PSA. What I see all the time is people go in there and they put in a cost and they put in one cost across the level, right? Level 1 is $45. Level 2 is $55. Level 3 is $65, whatever the numbers are. And that's a mistake, right? Some people have health insurance and others don't. Some people, have a higher base salary. You got to get actual cost per person to see, are the people that you're paying the most to, are they really that much more productive? Are they generating that much revenue per employee? But whatever way you use, if you use standard cost or you use actual P&L by customer in QuickBooks, you have to look on a regular basis, at least quarterly, but at least in the start, we do it every month. Look at the bottom 15% profit clients.
Yes.
And then do one of 3 things. And we're talking about gross profit, right?
Yeah.
The first thing what we do is we suggest that you want to calculate your total overhead for the year and then divide that by the number of billable hours that you've got, or chargeable hours. So if you got 10 people and there's 2,080 hours a year and you're going to have 80% utilizations, you got 1,600 hours, right, per person, just round number. You take your total overhead divided by the total number of available hours. So 1,600 available hours. If you had 10 employees, that's 16,000 hours, right? If you got $1.6 million of overhead, that's $10 an hour. You got to make sure that your projects are covering their share of the overhead and generating your net income profits. If you want to make 15% profit, right? A well-run company makes 12 to 15% profit. The market leaders make 15 to 20% margin. When you sell the company, the value of your business is going to be directly a function of what's your net income percentage. Are you a well-run company, or are you a market leader? And if you're below 12%, if you've got 8% margins, you're going to struggle to get your valuation. Now, if you look at the bottom 15%, you're going to get addition through subtraction, additional profit through subtraction. And you follow one of 3 steps. Step one is dig into the details to see where's the time leakage. Where are the hidden costs? Project management. I'm amazed how many people have project managers below the line in overhead.
100% agree.
Why do they do that? Because it's management, right? It's a cost of management, and management is below the line.
Well, I hear clients often tell me, well, the client would never agree to pay for project management. Like, that's your problem, not theirs, right? Like,
well, the client, you're not telling them that they're paying for project management, but it has to be baked into your pricing.
I agree, 100%, yeah. That's one of the strongest drivers for me around fixed fee pricing for projects is that it shouldn't be up to the client's discretion about how you run the projects. It's a part of the cost. So if you have clients pushing back on you against the cost of project management being a line item or hourly, that is a strong motivator for fixed fee projects where it's just value delivered, right? Like, here's the 100%. Cost. This is what you get. Does that make sense? Don't look at these line items and say, well, if we have Jerry from the stockroom, if he does this part of the project, can you give us a discount? Like that? Oh, no. These are not conversations you want to have.
Now you're talking about transactional clients as opposed to transformational clients.
Right. Yep.
That's what when we bring on a client, sometimes we have transactional clients. My bookkeeper quit. Can you do the billing? Can you do the collections? Can you pay the bills? Can you reconcile the bank account? Yeah, no problem. We're good at that. And then you have other clients who come in and says, I'm making 7% profits. I sometimes have cash flow problems because I'm only making 7% profits. And that's why you have cash flow problems. And I want to get to that 12 to 15. Those are transformational clients. And then, everything we do is fixed fee. Unless we're doing a QuickBooks system tune-up or a project that's just a cleanup, that we do on an hourly, but all of the accounting is fixed fee because we don't want you saying to us, can you lower your fee if we don't have a phone call at the end of the month to read and interpret the results, right? That's where the value is. So you look at that bottom 15%, and the first step is to look at the true cost, and you have a conversation with the prospect to say, here is the scope of the work that we have outlined for you when we price this, and here's what reality is. So we have three choices. I can increase my fees to reflect the real value that you're getting from us. Option two is I can lower my fees to stay within your budget, but you're going to have to be the project manager, and I'm not going to deliver this extra out of scope work, or I need to transition you to another service provider, and our contract calls for 60 days notice. And so at the end of this call, if we don't work out, I'm going to start that 60-day clock. What I have found is almost 90% of the time, if your clients are happy with your work and you can show them the value that they're getting for that additional fee, nobody wants to change IT companies. It's a nightmare. It's at least another $10,000 or $15,000 startup cost. So if you're coming back to me and saying, I got to charge you $1,000 a month, done. I'm if you're happy with them.
Right.
And that's that, show the value or lower the scope, or I got to get you out. And when you give somebody an option, they're now more likely to be, they'll feel like you've put it in their control. All the value pricing people say this. When you give them an option, they feel good about the process. They're more likely to say, okay, this is what I can do.
Another one I wanted to circle back on is AR, because I think that this is a big trigger for cash flow issues. And again, sort of the steps around maturity and changes that people could potentially be looking to implement. I'm still shocked by the number of people that are 45 days on AR, right? Yeah. They're sending out a bill at the beginning of the month, and then they're giving them 6 weeks to pay them on that. When, quite frankly, this is a fixed fee business. Like, most of the industry is doing all you can eat pricing on a per seat basis. The person knows how much they're going to be paying, so why not run it as utility billing? It's your agreement is $3,000 a month or $8,000 a month, whatever it is. You bill them $8,000 or $3,000 on the first of the month, and even better, you're direct debiting some form of payment on the first of the month. I don't see a scenario where it makes sense to give people such long terms on essentially a fixed fee service delivery. What do you see as sort of the percentage of people that are on the billing on the first of the month versus sending out invoices and trying to collect over the next 6 weeks?
Well, our clients, it's 50-50 coming in and 80-20 going out, right? It's like, this is one of the first things we do, because cash flow is about the timing,
right?
Timing of when money flows in and when money flows out. And it's really helpful to understand, if payroll is your biggest expense, if it's 70 to 80% of your expenses, you've got to have the timing of when you get paid be before you pay payroll. It's that simple. And if you and this is true whether you're in a recession or you're in a booming economy, right? These are fundamental aspects. Step one is get the cash flow forecast, because that tells you, do I have to focus on collections, or, do I have an issue with the bank, whatever I need. Then the next step then is to really understand your days sales outstanding, your DSO. Your days sales outstanding is the number of days that it takes for you to collect $1 of payroll. And what we recommend is you want to automate the billing and collections process. So ideally, you're debiting their bank account, and every bank has that ability. If not, and that's what we do, that's what we advise our clients to do. If not, then now's a good time to start to think about taking credit card. Right. And the reason is because the 3%, the 3.5% of cost for your merchant fee, unless you have big ticket expenses, like if you got a $20,000 project, I would not put that on a credit card. You don't want to have that big amount. But when you're talking about, the monthly billing, what it does is, number one, it eliminates the risk of default. Now, MasterCard and Visa have to go get them. Number two, when you implement Intuit merchant services, you can automate the entire process. And this comes to that sharpening the saw and lowering your overhead costs too. If you've got one person who's, doing billing and collections, then what's the cost of that person versus can I eliminate that headcount by automating it? And how does this work? Intuit merchant services and Intuit payment solutions, to me, it's magic. You have the ability inside basic QuickBooks, desktop or online, to go and send an email to the client, which everybody pretty much does. But when you turn on merchant services, it adds a pay now button. You've seen it from, your handyman and the plumber. It's like, you get an email from QuickBooks that says pay now, and then you can enter in the credit card number. And what it does is it not only automates the billing and collections process. So now you got the money collected by the credit card, but because it's inside Intuit, it knows what the invoices are, and it automatically applies the payment against the outstanding invoice. So you've eliminated the bookkeeping function. So when you look at the cost of a bookkeeper, if you can automate that 2.5-3% is nothing. But here's the magic. Because it's all connected to the inside Intuit, if the customer doesn't answer the email, it knows, okay, that customer balance is still outstanding. It'll automatically send another email out. So we set our clients up to send out an invoice every Sunday. Why Sunday? I got to be an Inc. 500 featured speaker for a couple of years, which was really fun. And I did a study of the Fortune 1000 cash flow best practices. And what you find is that if you send invoices out on Saturday or Sunday, you get paid 7 days faster than if you invoice on Tuesday, Thursday, or Friday.
Interesting.
Because isn't it interesting? And I dug into it. Why? When people think, your customer thinks, oh, these guys are serious about doing invoicing. They came in on Sunday to send the invoice. No, it's just automatically scheduled for Sunday morning. And then what happens is when you get the second invoice, they're like, oh, I'm going to make this go away. Let me enter my credit card number now. And your DSO, if you're getting paid net 30 or net 45, like your example, drops all the way down to net 14 because you made it easy for the customer to pay. And by automating the whole back office, you've automated the billing, the collections, and the cash application, which is a lot cheaper than actually paying a human being to do that manually, to pick up the phone and call.
Right on. Well, we'll look to wrap up here, Steve. This has been really, really useful. Lots of info here, and lots of actionables and stuff for people to chew on. As we look to wrap up here, any final thoughts or call to action for the listeners? I
think in a tech business, it's all about the people. We've got a people scorecard that shows you revenue per employee, labor cost per employee, and net income per employee. And I think you've got to look at that side by side with your P&L. Because if you can lower turnover, if you can increase productivity, if you can get people to give you discretionary effort, it starts to show in that revenue per employee number. And that drives your top line and your gross profit number. And so, when we look at helping clients increase their profits, you got to look and say, what are the drivers of increased profit? And when you make money on people's time, it's always the people. So either keep, bringing the right ones in, keeping them a long time, or increasing their productivity by having rewards and recognition and human capital strides. You can measure all that in a people score.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. Really appreciate your time, Stephen, and thanks for being a guest.
My pleasure. And if anybody has any questions, they can reach me at Stephen, Stephen, at growthforce.com is my email. Or I'm on LinkedIn, Stephen King CPA, and www.growthforce.com is our website. We've got a blog and a podcast that kind of shares all this stuff.
Awesome. And we'll link to all of that and links to you in the show notes as well.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks.